Hello, this is Steve again with another YouTube video. It's time to do some writing. We haven't done any in a few weeks, and it's an important thing to practice because it's something you can practice a bit more. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at writing part 2 for B2 and C1. I've got many videos on the essay. We always practice the essay because you have to write an essay and it's 50%. But the other 50% in part 2 means choosing a task from different text types. So in this video, we're going to imagine you're in the exam. You've got 3 tasks. How do you choose which one to do? What does each text type need? So you're prepared for all of them. There's conventions, the details, the format, all these things that make a good answer for whichever one you choose in part 2. So here are some sample questions that I've made up that are supposed to be engaging, the same as a real Cambridge exam. They're giving you an opportunity to show off your English level. So pause the video, have a think. Which one would you choose? What are you thinking about? Why would you choose it? Write in the comments which one you're good at. And then we'll go through them and think, okay, here's how we're going to do them. Because obviously the first thing we need is a plan. You're going to use some time in the 40 minutes you have for part 2 to write a plan and think about not just what goes in the essay, but how to write as well. So let's get into that now. You've chosen which one you're going to do, but I'm going to go through them in order. We're going to start with the article about unusual hobbies. You have to say how you started and why it's appealing to you. The first obvious thing to do is you need to think of a hobby and it needs to fit. So probably don't say swimming, tennis, something that loads of people do. Go for something a little bit different. For example, one of my students said gymnastics. Gymnastics, I think I'll allow. Of course, people know what it is, but not that many people do it. Then we need for our content, because I like to think really the content criteria of our 4 criteria in the exam, this is the one that your plan that you actually write will be most focused on because it's what you're going to write. That's the content, that's the plan you've got. The other ones we'll talk about in a minute also come into it. So we're going to say gymnastics. And how did you start? She was inspired by her cousin. Note the use of words here is important. We are writing an article, which we'll talk about with communication, but not just my cousin did it and I did it. Too boring. Inspired by my cousin. Why is it appealing? Completing an impressive routine, meeting new people, team spirit, lots of good ideas that answer the question. So the content, this works. Now the other question is, what do we do with this content? How do we write it? And this is where communication comes in. For an article, you are trying to be interesting. You are trying to make something that people want to read when they open this website or this magazine, if they're very old, and they actually want to read what you've written. They don't get bored and they have some interest in getting to the end. How do we do that? Well, with things like I just said, specific detail and using some different adjectives makes it more interesting. Don't just say, I started because my cousin did it and I saw her. No, say, I was inspired by my cousin when I saw her perform an amazing pirouette. Sorry if this is not gymnastics. In the living room, and everybody clapped and it was a great feeling. And I said, I have to do this too. Right? That story, that detail makes it more interesting. The same for one of our conventions of an article. We're going to have a catchy title. It's going to be a relevant title to your hobby, but try and make it interesting. Maybe include a rhetorical question that, if we're talking about gymnastics, could be something like, when was the last time you tried to do the splits? I've missed a word there, sorry, but it's just a plan. Calm down. But it's an interesting question, isn't it? It makes you think, oh yeah, I haven't done the splits in ages. Obviously, this person can do them. That kind of personal detail is going to make it more interesting. So that's how you write it. You are thinking, here are my ideas. Here's how I need to express them to make a good article. Similarly, for our organization, I've got my ideas, but what do I do with them? Well, I'm going to start with a title. I'm going to have a little introduction, which I'm actually going to talk about in the next video. Next week, we're going to have a focus on introductions and conclusions. But my introduction for an article will give some context, introduce the topic, say what the hobby is. Maybe, like we said, have a little rhetorical question to create some interest. I think it makes sense to have 2 body paragraphs for our 2 points and a conclusion where we sum it up and then maybe add something a little bit interesting again to finish on that interesting note. In terms of language, Well, language always means the same thing for every writing task. It means at B2 and C1, some more unusual and complex vocab and grammar. You want to show that you don't just know the basics to communicate, but you can also express nuance and specific situations and details. In the case of writing about your hobby, well, you should choose one where you know some of the good words because you've watched videos about it, because you've talked about it, because you know the words. So maybe in terms of gymnastics, this could be somersaults and backflips and ribbons and clubs and hoops. Very nice vocab. In terms of grammar, well, advanced grammar. But what does that mean? Well, let's be specific. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that writing about hobbies, the first thing that came to mind for me was using comparatives and saying some hobbies are more interesting than others, or more unusual, or more difficult. So maybe comparatives would fit. And I've given you a little exercise. It's use of English part 4. You need to complete the second sentence so it means the same as the first. They are all comparatives. They are all the kind of language that if you can use it yourself, an examiner would notice and say, yes, they are using some more advanced grammatical structures. They can access the 5 out of 5 band for the language criteria. Pause the video and try and answer these questions. Here come the answers. Number 1, I am a much better rugby player. I play far better. Adverb, I am much better. Adjective. Number 2, was not as long as I expected. As long as, we know this comparative structure. And the third one, another nice comparative structure. The more you do, the more something else. The more, or the less, or the more, the less. But the more, the more, a nice comparative structure that could be tested in use of English part 4, but could also be used in your writing as one of these advanced structures that gets you these points for the top band. Okay, so that is what I was thinking about for an article. With all of those details, if you've thought of all of that and got all those ideas and planned everything, it should be very difficult to write a bad article. You know, you've done most of the work. Now it's just a case of getting it down, being careful, checking your work when you finish, using all the time, like we've spoken about in previous videos. So that's if you chose the article. Let's hope that's good. If you chose the letter of application, well, it's a very different type of writing, but we can apply the same rules to think what makes it a good piece of writing. You're going to be a tour guide in your city. You're going to write a letter of application for this job. So what do we need to think about? Take a minute yourself and maybe try and plan it like I just did. Think about content, what I need to include. Communication, what do I need to keep in mind in terms of how I'm expressing myself. Organization, where do I put everything? And language, well, language, don't worry about it. If you can think of some specific vocab for tourism or job applications, that would be fantastic. I do have a letter of application video that's got loads of good vocab you can use, but we'll also talk about some advanced grammar in a minute. Pause the video and try and plan it yourself. This is the best practice you can get. Here's what I would say. Well, content, the main content is why you should have this job. Really, this is the same kind of question, isn't it? Why you want the job is not because you are desperate for money, because they're probably not going to give the job to a person who says, I'm desperate for money. If it was your company, you wouldn't hire a person who said, I only want this job because I want money. Right? A bit of putting yourself in the manager's shoes. The reason you want the job is that you're good at it, is that you're interested in history, that you've got a good English level, that you like talking to people, you want to share this, all these kind of things. And what makes you suitable? Well, we could think of that as being the evidence of why you are good at it, of what skills you've got. That's what makes you suitable, that everything you're saying, that I've got these things. For example, this. For example, my knowledge of local Spanish music would make me a fantastic person to transmit this to visitors. My level of English, I've got this certificate. I've traveled abroad and communicated. And my social skills have been commended by my teachers, colleagues, people in my local organizations, and so on. You're giving evidence, and again, try and include that in your plan. In terms of communication, I guess what most people are thinking is that, and you are right, it should be formal. Yes, because you're writing to a hiring manager. They sound like an important person. It's an important topic. Let's be formal. But that's a bit secondary. As I said in my letter of application video, the most important thing in a letter of application is the tone, which needs to be very positive. Everything needs to be spun, right? Put in a very positive way. So if we go back to this example of the English level, who are you going to hire? The person who says, I can speak English, but I've only got a B1 level because I find it quite difficult. Although, yes, I do speak English. Or the person who says, my English is good, having achieved a B1 certificate and having spent a summer abroad, being able to communicate in many different situations. Because they both said the same thing. They both said they've got a B1 level of English. But how they said it, the communication, this is what makes the difference. You're going to hire the positive person. If this is the person you're going to hire, this is a better letter of application. It gets a higher mark. They want a realistic letter of application. So be positive because it should be like that. In terms of organization, again, little conventions to include. It's a letter, so we are going to include a greeting. In this case, we are given the greeting in the question, right to the hiring manager. Let's say, dear hiring manager. We don't know if it's a man or a woman. Sir or madam might be a bit old-fashioned, so let's say, dear hiring manager. We're going to have an introduction where we, again, give some context and say, this is the job I want, and so on. 2 to 3 paragraphs, maybe depending on what skills and what focuses you're going to talk about. And then maybe some kind of closing phrase to finish. Closing phrases that you should have studied from the different videos I've posted and the work you've done, such as, I look forward to hearing from you soon. In terms of language, well, like we said, any specific vocab you can think of for this job, for tourism, for sharing history, culture, knowledge, and so on. And in terms of advanced grammar, I was thinking maybe gerunds, like, I look forward to hearing from you soon. But again, I've got a video on this from 2 or 3 weeks ago where we looked at gerunds and infinitives in Use of English Part 4, because it's a really common grammar point that you should be able to use in your own writing. So again, if you can use these kind of phrases correctly, you are using advanced grammar for B2 and C1. Pause the video, answer the questions. Here come the answers. Number 1, we know how to say worth. Something is worth doing. It is worth taking a boat tour. Number 2, you're considering, you're thinking about doing something. Visiting, or I guess going, coming also fits, but we said visit in the question, so we say visiting. And number 3, we know how to use recommend by now. You recommend doing something. Communicating with people, with touch. This is staying or keeping in touch. Maybe getting in touch as well would be acceptable. So there we go, 3 little Use of English Part 4 questions. Use gerunds in your writing in different ways, and this will be noticed as higher level, a more advanced grammar for the higher grades. So that's our letter of application. Again, once we've got all these ideas and this plan, should be an easy job to write it. Option 3, you are writing a review of a YouTube channel that you like, and you're including details of what makes it different. Again, you can try and plan this yourself. Here's how I planned it. I would say content. Well, I definitely need to give basic details of what the channel is. The channel I chose was a mukbang channel. I say I chose. My student chose it because that's what she likes. And I think mukbang, we have to explain what it is. We have to say this mukbang channel shows sulgi eating different types of Asian food, very close up and preparing and eating them. And why do I like it? What makes it different? Because it's very satisfying to see the nice food when you're hungry. It's also good for sleeping because it's quiet and relaxing. And in a review, the other convention that we should include is a recommendation. And be specific. Don't just say everyone would like this, because I think a lot of people would not like it. A lot of people don't like watching people eat food very close with all the sounds. Maybe people who like Asian food would like it, people who like Asian culture, but maybe some people wouldn't. So think about your recommendations specifically. In terms of communication, it's quite similar to an article because it's a popular piece of writing in the popular press, going to be published in a magazine or on a website. So you're going to have a title that is kind of interesting, but also clear about what you're reviewing. An intro that catches the attention a bit, but gives basic details of the product. And your tone is probably going to be fairly informal. It can be formal as long as you're consistent. But for this question, a YouTube channel you like, it's a fairly personal thing. It's more likely going to be a bit more informal. In terms of organization, well, I think for a review, we've talked about this before on my videos. Introduction needs to give some basic details. Think about two features, two aspects of the thing you are reviewing, in this case a YouTube channel, and maybe have a paragraph for each and go into detail explaining the good and bad points of them. And then your conclusion is the recommendation, like we said, a specific recommendation. Language, again, specific vocab. Thinking about mukbangs, you are talking about Korean fried chicken and kimchi soup and specific things that show off that you really know what you're talking about. And you could also use some advanced grammar, such as conditionals. Here you have 3 conditionals questions. Do you know how to use conditionals correctly, following the standard rules of English? Pause the video and test if you do. You should have, for number 1, here comes the answer. They won't pay attention, because we're talking about not getting bored, paying attention, unless YouTubers use. We're talking about a first conditional. Number 1 was the first conditional. Will, not, will, and present. Number 2, if I had time, I would watch. Second conditional, pretty simple. And number 3, bit of a jump in difficulty here. It's a third conditional, but it's also using the had I discovered instead of if I had discovered, the different structure in how we say third conditional sentences. Had I discovered means if I had discovered. But there we go. Those are some impressive conditionals that you could use in your writing to show off your range of grammar. And we've now planned all 3 of our questions. So congratulations. I hope that was useful. Your homework is to write not one of those questions, because that would be too easy. You've already planned it with all my ideas. Now you need to do your own writing. So I have 3 more questions here. You're going to choose one and write that for your homework, planning it and thinking about the criteria in the same way we have done in this video. I hope that was useful, and you will tune in next week for our special writing part 2, where we focus on introductions and conclusions, because I think I've prepared this in a pretty interesting way. Thank you. Goodbye.